A 4-year-old boy calls 911 and asks for a Happy Meal. After listening to his request, the cops' faces turn pale as they rush to save the boy. What could this innocent boy have said? Did the cops manage to save him in time? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Through the dimly lit kitchen, 4-year-old Jamal sat cross-legged on the cold linoleum floor, his small body pressed against the bottom cabinet. His tiny fingers clutched his mother's phone, trembling as he carefully pressed the numbers just like she had taught him. 911. His heart thumped loudly in his chest as he heard heavy footsteps from down the hall, where his father was pacing in the bedroom. Behind Jamal in the living room, his mother lay still on the carpet, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The phone rang once, twice, and then a warm voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? Jamal's voice came out in a whisper, barely louder than a mouse. I'd like to order a Happy Meal, please. There was a brief pause on the line. Hello there, sweetheart. I'm Officer Kelly Parker. Could you tell me more about your Happy Meal order? Jamal's eyes darted to the hallway as another heavy footstep creaked on the floorboards. His small hand squeezed the phone tighter. I want chicken nuggets, he whispered, his voice quivering. Kelly's fingers flew across her keyboard, her trained eyes catching the caller ID and address while keeping her voice steady and cheerful. That sounds delicious. What kind of toppings would you like on that meal? Jamal swallowed hard, tears welling up in his eyes as he heard his father's angry muttering getting closer. No toppings. My dad doesn't like them. Mom is sleeping and won't wake up. Kelly's heart clenched at the boy's words, but her voice remained calm and steady. She signaled to her supervisor, pointing at her screen while continuing to type. I understand, sweetie. Is your dad near you right now? No, Jamal whispered, his eyes fixed on the hallway. He's in his room. But Mommy's sleeping and won't wake up. Kelly's fingers moved even faster across her keyboard as she dispatched units to the address. Officer Samuel Reed's team was closest, and she knew his experience with sensitive situations would be crucial. I see. Would you like a toy with your Happy Meal? Yes, please hurry, Jamal replied, understanding the game they were playing. A tear rolled down his cheek as he heard his father's footsteps getting closer. Help is on the way, Kelly said softly, disguising her words in a cheerful tone. Your special Happy Meal will be there very soon. Can you stay on the line with me? Jamal's breath hitched as a shadow appeared at the end of the hallway. No, he whispered, his voice thick with fear. My father is coming, thank you. His small finger pressed the red button to end the call, just as his father's large frame filled the kitchen doorway. Marcus James's eyes narrowed as he spotted his son on the floor, the phone still clutched in Jamal's trembling hands. His face darkened with anger, and he took a menacing step forward. The phone slipped from Jamal's fingers, clattering on the linoleum floor. His father's shadow loomed over him, growing larger with each step, and Jamal pressed himself harder against the cabinet, making himself as small as possible. Jamal's small hands shook as he placed the phone back on the kitchen counter, stretching up on his tiptoes to reach. His eyes darted to the living room where his mother lay motionless on the cream-colored carpet, her chest rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. A purple bruise was forming on her temple, and her dark curls splayed around her head like a broken halo. The house felt too quiet, like the silence before a storm. The only sounds were the heavy footsteps of his father pacing in the other room, and the tick-tock of the kitchen clock that seemed to count down to something terrible. Marcus's boots scraped against the hallway floor as he stumbled into the kitchen. His eyes were bloodshot, and the smell of whiskey rolled off him in waves. He squinted at Jamal, swaying slightly where he stood. When is the delivery coming, boy? He demanded, his words slurring together. Jamal's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his voice steady just like his mother had taught him. Soon, Daddy, he whispered, trying not to look at the empty bottle on the counter. Marcus dropped heavily into one of the kitchen chairs, making it creak under his weight. Better not cost too much, he muttered, running a hand over his unshaven face. Already behind on the bills. Your mama thinks money grows on trees. He let out a bitter laugh that made Jamal flinch. From his spot near the counter, Jamal could see both his father and his mother. He watched her breathing, counting each rise and fall of her chest like counting sheep at bedtime. 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3 breaths. As long as she was breathing, she would wake up. She had to wake up. The minutes crawled by like hours. Marcus continued his angry mumbling about money and jobs and how nothing ever went right. Jamal stayed perfectly still, the way he did when he saw a scary dog. No sudden movements, no loud noises. His mother had taught him that too. A soft moan came from the living room. Tiana's fingers twitched, but her eyes remained closed. Jamal wanted to run to her, to hold her hand and tell her everything would be okay, but he stayed rooted to his spot. He thought about the nice lady on the phone, Officer Kelly, and her promise that help was coming. Then he heard it, the faint wail of sirens in the distance. The sound grew louder with each passing second, like an answer to his prayers. Marcus's head snapped up, his bleary eyes suddenly sharp with suspicion. The sirens grew closer and closer until they seemed to fill the whole world. A heavy knock echoed through the house, making both Jamal and Marcus jump. Marcus's face twisted with confusion, then dawning apprehension as the sirens continued to wail outside their door. The front door flew open with a violent jerk as Marcus yanked it, his face contorted with a mix of rage and fear. Before he could even process the scene before him, Officer Reed and 2 other uniformed officers burst through the doorway, their weapons drawn and steady. "Get down, on the ground now!" Officer Reed's voice boomed through the house, firm and authoritative. Marcus stumbled backward, his alcohol-addled mind struggling to comprehend the situation. "This is my house!" he slurred, his fists clenching at his sides. Officer Thompson, a tall woman with determined eyes, quickly moved toward Jamal, positioning herself between him and Marcus. "Come here, sweetheart," she said softly, guiding him behind her while keeping her eyes trained on Marcus. The third officer, Martinez, rushed to Tiana's side, pressing 2 fingers against her neck. "We need medics in here now," he called out, his voice urgent but controlled. Marcus's face twisted with fury as he took an aggressive step forward. "This is family business," he shouted, spittle flying from his mouth. "You got no right." Before he could finish, Officer Reed and Martinez moved in perfect sync, taking Marcus down to the floor. Despite his drunken struggles and stream of obscenities, they had him in handcuffs within seconds. Paramedics rushed through the open door, their equipment rattling as they hurried to Tiana's side. Jamal watched them work, his small fingers gripping Officer Reed's uniform pants tightly. The officer placed a gentle hand on Jamal's shoulder. "You did good, buddy," Officer Reed said softly, his voice warm and reassuring. "You're very brave, you know that?" Marcus thrashed against his restraints as Martinez and another officer who had arrived began dragging him toward the door. "This ain't right," he bellowed. "You can't come in here. This is family matters." His shouts grew fainter as they led him outside to the waiting patrol car. The paramedics worked quickly, attaching monitors to Tiana and carefully stabilizing her neck. Their movements were swift but gentle as they transferred her onto a stretcher. "BP is stabilizing," one paramedic announced. "Let's get her loaded up." Jamal's grip on Officer Reed's pants tightened as he watched them wheel his mother toward the door. Officer Reed crouched down beside him, meeting his eyes with a kind, steady gaze. "Your mom's going to be okay," he promised, his voice gentle but firm. "We'll make sure you're safe." Jamal nodded, feeling a small spark of hope flutter in his chest as he looked up at the officer's reassuring face. The patrol car's engine hummed softly as Officer Reed navigated the quiet streets. In the back seat, Jamal clutched a small brown teddy bear close to his chest, his fingers running repeatedly through its soft fur. The bear wore a tiny paramedic uniform, complete with a miniature stethoscope around its neck. Red and blue lights from passing emergency vehicles painted shifting patterns across Jamal's face as he stared out the window. Officer Reed checked his rearview mirror every few minutes, his experienced eyes taking in the boy's withdrawn posture. "You doing okay back there, buddy?" Reed asked gently, keeping his voice low and steady. Jamal nodded slightly, his grip on the bear tightening. At the station, Officer Reed led Jamal to a small room decorated with cheerful posters and filled with toys. A low table sat in the center, covered with blank paper and boxes of fresh crayons. Reed pulled up a child-sized chair next to Jamal. "Can you tell me about what happened at home?" Reed asked, sliding some paper and crayons toward Jamal. Jamal picked up a black crayon and began drawing rough shapes. "Daddy gets mad when he drinks the bad juice," he said quietly, his hand moving in sharp, angry strokes across the paper. "He yells at Mommy about money, says she's hiding it." Reed watched as Jamal switched to a red crayon, making harsh zigzag lines across the page. "Sometimes he hits her," Jamal continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "She tries to be quiet so I won't hear, but I do." Through the observation window, other officers gathered, their faces grim as they listened. Detective Martinez flipped through a file, pointing to previous reports of domestic disturbances at the address. "Last month," Jamal said, now drawing with a blue crayon, "Daddy broke Mommy's leg. He hits her a lot." His lower lip trembled slightly as he added stick figures to his drawing. "He said bad words and threw things." Officer Reed's professional mask slipped slightly, his jaw tightening as he listened. His hands, resting on the table, curled into loose fists before he consciously relaxed them. "Jamal," Reed said softly, waiting until the boy looked up at him. "What happened tonight isn't your fault. Your daddy won't be able to hurt you or your mommy anymore." "Promise?" Jamal's voice was small but hopeful. Reed nodded firmly. "I promise. Your mom is strong and she'll be okay. We will visit her at the hospital tomorrow morning." He offered Jamal a reassuring smile, which the boy returned with a tired nod, his small hand still clutching the paramedic bear. The morning sun crept through the hospital window, painting warm stripes across the sterile white sheets. Tiana's eyelids fluttered, her consciousness slowly returning like waves lapping at a shore. The steady beeping of monitors filled the quiet room as a nurse in light blue scrubs adjusted something beside the bed. "Good morning," the nurse said softly, noticing Tiana's awakening. "You're at Memorial Hospital. You're safe now." Tiana's throat felt dry and her head throbbed dully. Memories of the previous night flooded back. Marcus's anger, his fists, then darkness. Her heart rate quickened on the monitor as panic seized her. "Where's my son?" The words came out raspy but urgent. "Where's Jamal?" The nurse placed a gentle hand on Tiana's arm. "Your son is safe. He's with Officer Reed at the police station." She reached for the phone on the bedside table. "I'll call them right now." As the nurse dialed, she explained how Tiana had arrived by ambulance the night before, with a concussion and some bruising. "You've been here about 8 hours," she said. "The doctors want to keep you for observation, but you're going to be fine." At the precinct, Officer Reed sat at his desk, watching Jamal color quietly in a chair nearby. The boy hadn't slept much, but he'd remained remarkably calm throughout the long night. When the phone rang, Reed answered it quickly, his face breaking into a smile as he listened. "Hey, buddy," he said to Jamal, crouching down beside him. "It's time to see your mom." Jamal's eyes lit up, the first real spark of joy since the previous evening. Reed helped him gather his things, including the paramedic bear that hadn't left the boy's grip all night. The morning traffic moved steadily as Reed's patrol car made its way to the hospital. Jamal pressed his face against the window, watching the city wake up around them. His small fingers worked through the bear's fur in a soothing rhythm, a habit he'd developed over the past several hours. When they reached Tiana's room, Reed held Jamal's hand as they walked in. The moment Tiana saw her son, tears welled up in her eyes. Despite her bruises and the IV in her arm, she opened her arms wide. Jamal broke free from Reed's grip and ran to the bed, scrambling up and throwing himself into his mother's embrace. Tiana held him close, pressing kisses to the top of his head. "You're so brave, my little man," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Officer Reed watched the reunion for a moment before stepping toward the door. "If you need anything, please don't hesitate to call," he said quietly, pulling out his card and placing it on the nearby table. Then he slipped out, leaving mother and son to their private moment. Tiana lay in the hospital bed, her body still aching but comforted by the warm weight of Jamal sleeping against her chest. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting a gentle glow across the sterile white room, softening the harsh hospital equipment that surrounded them. Her fingers absently stroked through her son's curly hair as she listened to his steady breathing, grateful for this moment of peace after the chaos of the previous night. The rhythmic sound of footsteps in the hallway caught her attention, echoing against the polished floors. They grew louder, more distinct, until a figure appeared in the doorway. The sight made her breath catch in her throat and her hand stilled in Jamal's hair. There stood Daniel Carter, his police uniform crisp and neat, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. His kind eyes, showing the wear of years on the force, widened as they met hers, recognition and shock mixing in their depths. He took a halting step into the room, his usual confidence replaced by disbelief, one hand gripping the doorframe as if to steady himself. "I don't believe it's you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, rough with emotion. "Daniel," Tiana breathed, her heart racing as memories flooded back, of shared laughter, tender moments, and painful goodbyes. 1,000 emotions crossed her face. Surprise, joy, regret, and something deeper she couldn't name. Something that had never quite faded despite the years apart. They had been in a relationship years ago, and she was shocked to see him standing there. He moved closer to the bed, his steps careful and measured as if approaching a dream that might vanish. "I heard about what happened at the precinct this morning," he explained, his voice still gentle, almost reverent. "If I'd known it was you, I would have been there immediately." "It's been a long time," Tiana said, adjusting slightly in the bed, wincing at the movement. "Too long," Daniel agreed, his eyes showing a depth of feeling that made Tiana's chest tighten. "I've thought about you, wondered if—" He paused, collecting himself, running a hand through his short, dark hair. "I'm so sorry, Tiana. About everything. About how things ended between us. About not being there when you needed someone. I should have tried harder to find you." Against her chest, Jamal stirred, perhaps sensing the intensity of the moment. His eyes fluttered open, taking in the new presence in the room with quiet curiosity. Daniel's expression softened as he noticed the boy's awakening, and a warm smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "He's cute," Daniel said, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he looked at Jamal, genuine warmth in his voice. "He has your eyes." Tiana gathered her strength, looking up at Daniel with clear eyes. Despite her bruises and exhaustion, there was a firmness in her voice as she said, "I'm better." The words carried the weight of years, of battles fought and survived. Daniel's eyes grew wet and he swallowed hard, emotion evident on his face as he stood there, taking in the sight of Tiana and her son. His hands opened and closed at his sides as if fighting the urge to reach out and touch them, to make sure they were real. Daniel moved closer to Tiana's bedside, his heart pounding with renewed purpose. Each step felt weighted with years of unspoken feelings and missed opportunities. His voice was soft, yet carried an urgent tone as he spoke, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "You know, your husband will be in jail for a long time now, and you clearly need someone to support you. I still love you after all these years. Please, you both come with me." Tiana raised her hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. The gesture was gentle but firm, and Daniel fell silent. Her eyes, though tired from everything she'd endured, held a steady gaze as she looked up at him. The afternoon sunlight filtering through the hospital window cast shadows across her face, highlighting how much the illness had already taken from her. "Daniel, there's something you need to know," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor. She paused, gathering her strength before continuing, her fingers absently smoothing the thin hospital blanket. "I have cancer. Terminal." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, shattering his hopeful vision of their future together. The color drained from his face as he took an unsteady step backward, his composure crumbling. His mouth opened and closed, trying to form words that wouldn't come. The fluorescent light suddenly seemed too harsh, the room too small. Finally, he managed to whisper, "No, Tiana." Tears welled up in his eyes, threatening to spill over. The hospital room fell silent, the steady beep of monitors the only sound breaking through the heavy stillness. Jamal shifted in his mother's arms, his young face showing concern as he picked up on the sudden change in mood. He looked between his mother and Daniel, his small hand clutching tighter to Tiana's hospital gown, his dark eyes wide with worry. Tiana drew in a deep breath, her shoulders straightening despite the obvious effort it took. Her determination shone through even as exhaustion pulled at her features. "If you truly love me, Daniel, promise me one thing," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Take care of my boy when I'm gone. He needs someone who'll love him as fiercely as I do." Daniel dropped to one knee beside her bed, tears now flowing freely down his face. His police badge caught the light as he moved, a reminder of his sworn duty to protect and serve, a duty that would now extend far beyond his professional life. He nodded, his voice thick with emotion as he responded, "I promise, Tiana. I'll take care of him." Tiana's eyes filled with grateful tears as she watched Daniel make this solemn vow. Jamal looked up at Daniel, his young face serious and contemplative, as if he understood the weight of this moment. Between the three of them, a profound silence settled, heavy with the gravity of the promise that had just been made. The afternoon sun continued its slow descent, casting long shadows across the room as their lives changed forever in that quiet hospital room. The day of Tiana's passing finally arrived. The hospital corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before them, its sterile white walls a stark contrast to the darkness of the moment. Daniel stood rooted to the spot, his police uniform wrinkled from hours of vigil, as he held 5-year-old Jamal tightly in his arms. Their eyes followed the slow procession of hospital staff wheeling Tiana's covered body away from the room that had become their second home over the past weeks. Tears streamed freely down Daniel's face, leaving wet trails that he didn't bother to wipe away. His chest felt tight, constricted with a grief that threatened to overwhelm him. But he forced himself to stay strong, knowing the precious weight in his arms needed him now more than ever. Jamal's small fingers dug into Daniel's shoulder as he watched the scene unfold before him. His dark eyes were wide with confusion and fear, trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly become too big, too empty. The boy hadn't spoken since the monitors had gone silent, since his mother's hand had grown cold in his grip. "I'll always be here, buddy, I promise," Daniel whispered into Jamal's ear, his voice rough with emotion. He gently rocked the boy, the way he'd seen Tiana do countless times before. The motion felt clumsy and unpracticed, but he knew he'd learn. He had to. The hospital staff moved quietly around them, their faces etched with sympathy. A nurse who had cared for Tiana touched Daniel's arm briefly as she passed, her eyes conveying silent support. Another wiped away tears as she gathered Tiana's remaining belongings. Jamal remained unnaturally still in Daniel's arms, his small body tense. His gaze never left the direction where they'd taken his mother, as if expecting her to return at any moment. The reality of the situation hadn't fully settled in yet. How could it for someone so young? Daniel's mind raced with thoughts of the future, of the enormous responsibility he'd taken on. The weight of his promise to Tiana pressed heavily on his heart. How would he manage? What did he know about raising a child? But looking down at Jamal's face, he knew with absolute certainty that he would find a way. He had to become everything this little boy needed. Reaching down, Daniel gently brushed away a tear that had escaped down Jamal's cheek. "We're in this together, kiddo," he said softly, adjusting his hold on the boy as they turned toward the hospital exit. The automatic doors slid open, revealing a world that would now belong to just the two of them. Daniel's key turned in the lock and he stepped into his modest 2-bedroom house with Jamal in his arms. The boy had fallen asleep during the car ride, his small frame exhausted from the emotional toll of the past few days. The living room, bathed in soft afternoon light, looked different now, no longer just a bachelor's space, but a home that needed to welcome a child. Setting Jamal down gently on the couch, Daniel looked around with new eyes. His police awards and certificates hung on one wall, while family photos dotted another. A small TV sat in the corner, and worn but comfortable furniture filled the space. It wasn't much, but it was warm and safe. The days that followed brought a whirlwind of changes. Daniel learned to wake up earlier, fumbling through morning routines with determination. He'd stand in the kitchen, consulting recipe books he'd never opened before, trying to make proper breakfasts instead of his usual coffee and toast. Sometimes the eggs were too runny, and the pancakes came out oddly shaped, but Jamal never complained. "Is this okay?" Daniel would ask, setting a plate in front of the boy. Jamal would nod, offering a small smile that made all the effort worthwhile. Homework time became their evening ritual. Daniel sat beside Jamal at the kitchen table, helping with math problems and spelling words. Sometimes, when a particular problem proved challenging, Jamal's eyes would drift to his mother's photo on the mantel. During these moments, Daniel would squeeze his shoulder gently, letting him know it was okay to miss her. The nights proved challenging. Daniel's police shifts often ran late, requiring careful coordination with a trusted babysitter. He'd return home exhausted, only to find himself unable to sleep, worried about being enough for the boy who now depended on him. Sometimes he'd hear Jamal crying softly in his room, and he'd sit with him until the tears subsided. "I miss Mommy," Jamal would whisper in the darkness. "I know, buddy, I miss her too," Daniel would reply, his heart aching for both of them. The police station had been understanding, adjusting his schedule to accommodate his new responsibilities. Still, there were times when emergency calls came in, forcing Daniel to scramble for last-minute childcare. Each time he had to leave Jamal even briefly, a knot formed in his stomach. But there were good moments too, precious instances that made everything worthwhile. Like when Jamal first laughed at Daniel's terrible attempt at a joke during dinner, or when they successfully built a pillow fort in the living room. These moments, though small, felt like victories. Every night after tucking Jamal into bed, Daniel would stand in the doorway watching him sleep. In these quiet moments, he'd renew his silent promise to Tiana and to himself. He would never let this boy down, no matter what it took. A few days later, Daniel invited a girl to his house for a date. Daniel straightened the tablecloth one last time, his fingers fidgeting with the edges as he adjusted the perfectly aligned silverware. The rich aroma of homemade lasagna filled the house, a recipe he'd spent hours perfecting, following his mother's handwritten instructions to the letter. Jamal sat cross-legged in the living room, absorbed in his coloring book, humming softly to himself as his crayons moved with careful precision across the page. The doorbell rang and Daniel's heart quickened. He smoothed down his shirt before opening the door to Emily, her blonde hair neatly styled in soft waves and a bottle of expensive wine in her manicured hand. Her warm smile faltered slightly when she spotted Jamal in the living room, her shoulders tensing almost imperceptibly. "Hi there," she said, her voice a touch too high, like someone speaking to a stranger's pet. "You must be Jamal." Jamal looked up from his coloring book and offered a shy wave, his eyes bright with hope for a new friend. "Hello, I'm drawing a dinosaur. Would you like to see? It's a T-Rex, but I made him friendly." "Maybe later," Emily replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes as she shifted her weight uncomfortably. She turned to Daniel, clearly relieved to change focus. "Something smells wonderful." During dinner, Jamal tried his best to join the conversation, sharing stories about school and his new friends with childish enthusiasm. Emily nodded politely, pushing her lasagna around her plate, but her responses grew shorter and more distant. Her eyes kept darting between Daniel and Jamal, as if trying to solve a puzzle she hadn't expected to encounter on what she'd assumed would be a romantic evening. "And then in art class, I made a picture of—" Jamal started enthusiastically, his fork raised mid-gesture. "That's nice," Emily cut in, checking her phone for the third time that evening, the screen illuminating her increasingly anxious expression. "Daniel, I hate to do this, but I just got a text from my sister. Plus, with you having this kid around, I don't think I can do this anymore." Daniel's heart sank as he watched Emily gather her things, making hurried excuses about family emergencies and early morning meetings. The evening had barely begun, the candles not even half burned, and she was already heading for the door with barely concealed relief. Daniel's jaw tightened as he watched Emily's taillights disappear down the dark street. Behind him, Jamal had fallen asleep on the couch, his small form curled around his favorite stuffed bear, Mr. Growls. The sight of him, peaceful and trusting, dark eyelashes resting against his cheeks, made everything else fade away into insignificance. The years rolled by like gentle waves, each one bringing new experiences and deeper bonds between Daniel and Jamal. What started as tentative steps into an unexpected life together grew into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Jamal's growth spurts kept Daniel busy with new clothes and shoes, while his expanding curiosity filled their days with endless questions about everything from dinosaurs to distant stars and the mysteries of how clouds made rain. Daniel mastered the art of juggling his police shifts with school schedules, becoming an expert at making it to every important moment in Jamal's life. He'd show up at school performances still in his uniform, drawing curious glances from other parents but beaming with pride as Jamal spotted him in the crowd. Sometimes he'd even rush straight from a long night shift, coffee in hand, just to watch Jamal's morning presentations. Their kitchen table became command central for homework sessions, scattered with textbooks and pencils as Daniel helped Jamal work through math problems and spelling lists. "You're getting better at this than me, buddy," Daniel would often say, watching Jamal's confidence grow with each solved equation. Empty juice boxes and cookie crumbs usually littered the table by the end of their study sessions, marking hours of focused work together. One sunny Saturday, Daniel ran alongside Jamal's wobbly bicycle, holding the seat steady as training wheels lay discarded in the garage. "I've got you," he called out, his heart swelling as Jamal pedaled faster, determination written across his face. When he finally let go, Jamal sailed down the sidewalk on his own, whooping with joy. The neighbors came out to cheer, and Mrs. Rodriguez from next door captured the moment on her phone. At parent-teacher conferences, Daniel sat alone in tiny chairs meant for elementary school parents, ignoring the whispered conversations and questioning looks. He focused instead on Mrs. Thompson's words about Jamal's kindness toward other students and his natural talent for storytelling. She particularly praised how Jamal had helped a new student feel welcome by sharing his lunch and showing him around the playground. Movie nights became their special tradition, with Jamal nestled against Daniel's side on their worn couch, sharing a bowl of popcorn as they watched everything from superhero films to nature documentaries. Jamal's laughter filled their home during funny scenes, the sound somehow making the house feel larger and warmer. They'd often pause the movie to discuss plot twists or debate which superpower would be the most useful in real life. Through it all, Tiana's presence remained, gentle but constant. Her photo, carefully framed in silver, stood watch on Jamal's bedside table. Sometimes Daniel would find Jamal talking to it softly, sharing his day with his mother's smiling image. In those moments, Daniel would quietly step back, giving Jamal space for these private conversations, while feeling grateful for the trust they shared. On special occasions, they'd light a candle beside her photo and share memories of her bright smile and loving heart. One of these ordinary days, playground buzzed with life on that bright afternoon, the sound of children's laughter bouncing off the metal slides and swing sets. Jamal, now 10 years old, darted between his friends during an intense game of tag, his sneakers kicking up wood chips as he ran. His dark curls bounced with each step, and his eyes sparkled with joy as he dodged another player's attempt to catch him. "Can't catch me," he called out, weaving past the jungle gym with the practiced ease of someone who knew every inch of the playground. His friend Marcus huffed behind him, determined but grinning as he gave chase. The game led Jamal toward the quieter corner of the playground, where tall oak trees cast dappled shadows on the ground. This spot, tucked away from the main play area, was usually empty except for fallen leaves and the occasional forgotten toy. As he slowed his pace to catch his breath, something caught his eye, a glint in the grass, like a piece of paper catching the sunlight. Curious, Jamal stepped closer, his heart suddenly skipping a beat as the shape became clear. There, lying face up in the grass, was a photograph. Not just any photograph, but one of his mother, Tiana. She wore the yellow sundress he remembered so well, her head thrown back in laughter, her eyes crinkled at the corners with joy. It was the same genuine warm smile that had lit up every room she entered. Jamal's hands trembled as he bent down to pick up the photo. The world around him seemed to fade away, the shouts of his friends, the creaking of the swings, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, all became distant echoes as he stared at his mother's face. Memories flooded his mind. The smell of her coconut lotion, the sound of her humming while she cooked, the feeling of her arms wrapped tightly around him in a hug. His fingers traced the edges of the photograph carefully, as if touching something incredibly fragile. Questions raced through his mind. How did this get here? Who could have dropped it? The photo looked worn but preserved, like it had been carried in someone's wallet for years. Just as Jamal straightened up, still holding the photograph close to his chest, a shadow fell across the ground in front of him. The sudden darkness made him look up, and there stood a man he'd seen years ago. The stranger's clothes were worn and dirty, his face weathered by time and hardship. But it was his eyes that caught Jamal's attention. They were fixed on the photograph, wide with recognition, and filled with a desperate longing that made Jamal take a small step backward. The man's presence loomed over him, and Jamal felt his heart pound against his ribs as their eyes met in a moment of tense silence. "That's your mama," the man said softly, his voice rough but gentle. "That's my Tiana." Jamal's fingers tightened around the photo as he took another step back. The man moved forward, keeping the distance between them small. "I'm Leon," he said, running a trembling hand through his unkempt hair. "I'm your father, Jamal. You were very small when they took you away. You remember me, right?" The words hit Jamal like a punch to the stomach. He shook his head, confusion clouding his thoughts. Daniel had never mentioned his real father, and the few memories he had from before were dark and scary. "You probably don't remember much," Leon continued, his eyes never leaving Jamal's face. "But I remember everything. How your mama used to sing you to sleep with that old lullaby about the moon and stars. How you wouldn't eat your peas unless she made funny faces at you." Each word seemed to pull at something deep inside Jamal's chest. He knew the kind of monster his father was. The details were right, things he barely remembered but felt true. Still, warning bells rang in his head, just like Daniel had taught him. At the nearby playground equipment, a woman in a blue sundress pretended to tie her daughter's shoelaces while watching them carefully. Maria, a regular at the playground, had noticed the tension in the boy's shoulders and the way he kept trying to step away. "We can be a family again," Leon said, his voice thick with emotion. "Now that your mama's gone, it's just you and me. We can start over, make things right." Jamal thought of Daniel at home, probably getting ready for his evening shift at the police station. He thought of their morning pancakes and bedtime stories. "I need to go," he said, turning to leave. Leon's hand shot out, gripping Jamal's arm. Not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to stop him. "Son, please." "Is everything okay here?" Maria's voice cut through the tension as she approached them, her phone visible in her hand. Leon's grip loosened, but he didn't let go completely. His face shifted into a pleasant smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Everything's fine. Just catching up with my boy. We need to head home now." Jamal felt Leon's gentle but insistent pull as they started walking away from the playground. His heart hammered in his chest as he glanced back one last time, seeing Maria with her phone pressed to her ear, worry etched across her face. She then called the cops, and coincidentally, the call got connected straight to Daniel, who was at his station that time. Daniel's hand trembled as he reached for his ringing phone, his other hand still hovering over the stack of paperwork on his desk. The precinct was quiet this late, with only the hum of fluorescent lights and distant radio chatter breaking the silence. "My name is Maria Rodriguez. I was at Riverside Park just now." Daniel's pen clattered to the desk as Maria described Jamal and the suspicious man who'd led him away. His throat went dry as she mentioned the photograph and the man's claims about being Jamal's father. "The way that boy looked back," Maria's voice cracked. "I should have done more." Daniel was already on his feet, signaling to the night shift officers. "You did the right thing calling," he assured her, though his heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear his own voice. "When exactly did this happen?" As Maria provided the details, Daniel's colleagues sprang into action. Daniel tried calling Jamal's phone, knowing he went to play in that park just an hour ago, but Marcus had already grabbed his phone and thrown it away. Within minutes, the precinct transformed from its late-night lull into a hub of focused activity. Officers pulled up records, and a name emerged: Leon James, with a history of substance abuse and petty crimes. "I should have been there," Daniel whispered, staring at Leon's mugshot on the computer screen. The guilt felt like a physical weight on his chest, making it hard to breathe. "Hey," Kevin Martinez, a junior officer who'd trained under Daniel years ago, approached his desk. "I might have an idea. There's a cluster of abandoned buildings out by the old industrial park. Lots of squatters out there if he's trying to lay low." Daniel nodded sharply, hope flickering in his chest. Teams were dispatched across the city, their radio updates creating a steady stream of chatter. Security camera footage showed glimpses of Leon and Jamal heading east, but the trail went cold at the edge of downtown. In a moment of desperation, Daniel found himself at the cemetery. The night air was cool against his face as he stood before Tiana's gravestone, moonlight casting long shadows across the ground. "I'll find him," he whispered, touching the cold stone. "I promise you, Tiana, I'll bring our boy home." The search continued through the night. False leads sent teams scrambling to abandoned houses and homeless shelters, each dead end adding to Daniel's mounting anxiety. Then, just as exhaustion began to set in, his radio crackled. "Detective Carter?" The voice belonged to an officer stationed near the industrial district. "We just spoke to Mr. Chen at the corner store on Mason Street. Says he saw a man matching Leon's description with a young boy, heading toward the old Phillips warehouse about an hour ago." Daniel's grip tightened on his steering wheel as he made a sharp turn, lights flashing but sirens silent. The warehouse district loomed ahead, a maze of abandoned buildings and broken dreams. But somewhere in that darkness, Jamal was waiting. And this time, Daniel wouldn't let him down. Moonlight filtered through the broken windows of the warehouse, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Jamal sat on a threadbare cot, his small frame shivering despite the mild temperature. The musty air carried the scent of decay and abandonment. Leon's footsteps echoed as he paced back and forth, his shadow dancing erratically on the walls. "We can start fresh, just you and me," he said, his voice shifting between gentle and desperate. "No one judging us. No one telling us we can't be a family." Jamal watched his father carefully, noting how Leon's hands trembled and his eyes darted around the room. One moment, Leon would smile warmly, sharing stories of Jamal's first steps. The next, his face would darken with anger as he ranted about Tiana leaving him. "I had everything once," Leon muttered, running his hands through his unkempt hair. "A good job, a beautiful wife, a perfect son. Then she took it all away. But now..." His voice cracked. "Now we have a second chance." Leon shuffled through an old backpack and pulled out something wrapped in faded newspaper. His hands steadied as he carefully unwrapped it, revealing a small stuffed elephant with worn fur and a missing ear. "This was your favorite," Leon said softly, his eyes growing distant. "You wouldn't sleep without it. I've kept it all these years, hoping..." His voice trailed off, and for a moment, genuine pain crossed his features. Jamal nodded, forcing a small smile. "Can you tell me more about when I was little?" he asked, his voice steady despite his racing heart. His eyes darted to the cell phone lying on a nearby table. Leon launched into another story, his exhaustion becoming evident as his words began to slur. Eventually, his head drooped, and soft snores filled the warehouse. Moving with careful precision, Jamal slid off the cot. His bare feet made no sound on the cold floor as he crept toward the table. Marcus's phone felt heavy in his small hands as he dialed the number he knew by heart. 1 ring, 2 rings. Then Daniel's voice, tense with worry. "Hello? Help me, Daddy, I'm at the old Marshall warehouse by 5th Avenue. He threw my phone away." Jamal whispered into the phone. A sudden movement caught his eye, Leon stirring on his chair. The phone slipped from Jamal's trembling fingers, clattering to the floor as Daniel's voice called out urgently from the other end before the line went dead. Daniel's heart thundered in his chest as he gripped his radio, barking orders to the responding units. "All units converge on the abandoned Marshall warehouse on 5th. Possible child abduction suspect inside?" His voice carried the weight of both officer and father as police cruisers raced through the night, their lights painting the streets in flashes of red and blue. Inside the warehouse, Leon jerked awake, his bleary eyes focusing on the phone lying on the concrete floor. Understanding dawned on his face, twisting his features into a mask of rage. He whirled toward Jamal, who backed away instinctively. "You called him, didn't you?" Leon roared, lunging forward and grabbing Jamal's arm. His fingers dug into the boy's flesh. "After everything I told you about being a family." Jamal's cry of pain echoed through the warehouse just as sirens pierced the night air. The sound of screeching tires and shouting voices filtered through the broken windows. Daniel arrived at the scene, his chest tight with fear as he heard Jamal's cry from inside. Without hesitation, he pushed past the line of officers setting up a perimeter. "Stand down," someone shouted, but Daniel couldn't wait. Kevin, the junior officer, immediately fell in behind him, providing backup as they entered the dark building. "Leon," Daniel's voice boomed through the warehouse. "Let him go." Leon held Jamal in front of him like a shield, his arms wrapped around the boy's chest. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. "He's my son. Mine." Daniel raised his hand, speaking in a measured tone despite the terror in his heart. "I know you love him, Leon. I know you want what's best for him." He took a careful step forward. "But this isn't the way. You're scaring him. This isn't what Tiana would want." "Don't you dare talk about her." Leon's grip tightened, making Jamal whimper. "Think about Jamal," Daniel continued, his voice softening. "Remember how you used to read him stories? How you kept his favorite elephant all these years? That's the father he needs, not this." Something flickered in Leon's eyes, a moment of clarity, of shame. His arms loosened just slightly, but it was enough. Kevin moved with lightning speed, tackling Leon from the side while Daniel rushed forward, pulling Jamal to safety. As officers swarmed in to restrain Leon, Daniel wrapped Jamal in his arms. The boy sobbed into his shoulder, his small body shaking. "You're safe now," Daniel whispered, unable to hold back his own tears. "I've got you." Leon struggled against the handcuffs, his anger dissolving into desperate pleas. "Please, we can start over. Jamal, please." His voice echoed through the warehouse as officers led him away, his face crumpling with regret and loss. The evening after the warehouse incident arrived as Jamal settled back into their home. Marcus was now in jail for life, and he felt safer than ever with Daniel. Daniel watched his son closely, noticing how the boy's eyes kept drifting to the few photos they had of Tiana on the mantel. A week later, while Daniel cleared out the dusty attic, the sound of footsteps on the creaky stairs made him turn. Jamal stood in the doorway, his small figure silhouetted against the light from below. "Can I help?" Jamal asked, stepping carefully around boxes filled with old memories. "Of course, buddy," Daniel smiled, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Just be careful with the dust up here." As they sorted through boxes together, Jamal's hand brushed against something leather-bound and worn. He pulled it free from beneath old blankets and picture frames. "Dad, look at this." Daniel moved closer, watching as Jamal's fingers traced the faded cover of what appeared to be a diary. The leather was soft with age, and a small inscription on the front read, "Tiana James," in delicate handwriting. "It's Mom's," Jamal whispered, his voice filled with wonder. He opened it carefully, as if handling something precious and fragile. The pages crackled softly as he turned them, revealing neat rows of handwriting. "Dear Selena," Jamal read aloud, his finger following the words. "Another year has passed and I still miss you every day. Sometimes I look in the mirror and imagine it's you looking back at me, just like when we were kids." Daniel's eyebrows shot up. "Selena?" he asked, leaning closer. "Listen to this part," Jamal continued reading. "I wish things had been different, that Mom and Dad hadn't separated us. Being twins meant we were never supposed to be apart, but life had other plans." "Twins?" Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. "Your mom never mentioned having a twin sister." Jamal's eyes lit up as he flipped through more pages. "There's so much here about Aunt Selena. Mom wrote about how they used to finish each other's sentences and how they promised to find each other again someday." Daniel sat back on his heels, processing this revelation. All those years he'd known Tiana, she'd carried this secret pain of separation. "These letters might help us find her," he said thoughtfully. "Really?" Jamal looked up, hope filling his eyes. We could find my aunt? We can try? Daniel nodded, picking up another letter that had fallen from the diary. Your mom left us some pretty good clues here. They shared a look of excitement and possibility, both knowing they were on the verge of discovering something that could change their lives. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by scattered papers and his laptop, making yet another phone call in a long series of attempts. His fingers drummed restlessly against the worn wooden surface as he waited for someone to pick up, his coffee growing cold beside him. Jamal perched on a nearby chair, methodically sorting through old letters from the diary and arranging them by date, his small hands handling each page with careful reverence. Yes, I'm looking for information about Selena Parker, Daniel said into the phone, his voice steady but hopeful, the same way it had been for dozens of calls before. She would be around 35 now. He scribbled detailed notes as he listened, adding them to an already growing pile of leads and dead ends. Jamal looked up from his task, his dark eyes bright with curiosity. Did they know her? Daniel shook his head, offering a small, encouraging smile. Not this time, buddy. But we're getting closer. I can feel it. Hours passed as they worked together in comfortable silence, Jamal helping by highlighting dates and places mentioned in Tiana's diary entries with his favorite yellow marker. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across their work, painting golden stripes on the kitchen walls when Daniel suddenly sat up straighter, his posture alert. Wait a minute, he muttered, typing rapidly on his laptop, the keys clicking furiously. His eyes widened as information appeared on the screen, his breath catching. Jamal, I think I found her. There's a Selena Parker living in Riverside, just 2 hours away from us. Jamal jumped up from his chair, nearly knocking over his glass of water in his excitement. Really? Can we go see her? Right now? Daniel double-checked the address, his heart racing with anticipation and nervous energy. The thought of meeting Tiana's twin sister filled him with a strange mix of emotions: hope, anxiety, and a touch of fear. Would she look just like Tiana? How would she react to learning about her sister's fate after all these years? Dad? Jamal's voice pulled him from his swirling thoughts. Do you think she'll like me? His words carried a hint of vulnerability that tugged at Daniel's heart. Daniel reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder warmly. She'll love you, just like your mom did. How could anyone not? They spent the next hour preparing for the trip, moving with purposeful excitement. Daniel packed a small overnight bag with essentials, while Jamal carefully wrapped Tiana's diary in a soft cloth, treating it like a precious treasure. He also insisted on bringing his mother's favorite photograph, the one where she was laughing in the summer sunlight, her eyes bright with joy, her smile radiant and carefree. Should we call first? Jamal asked as he helped load the car, his face serious and thoughtful. Daniel shook his head, adjusting the bag in the trunk. Sometimes news like this is better delivered in person. We need to see her face to face. Finally, they were ready. Daniel started the car, the engine humming to life as he checked the rearview mirror to see Jamal in the back seat, holding the diary close to his chest like a shield. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders as they pulled out of the driveway, heading toward what could be a life-changing meeting for all of them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neat garden path as Daniel and Jamal approached the modest house of Selena, her mother's twin sister. Wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze, their colors bright against the pale blue siding. Daniel's hand rested protectively on Jamal's shoulder as they reached the front door. Taking a deep breath, Daniel pressed the doorbell. The sound echoed inside, followed by footsteps approaching. When the door opened, both Daniel and Jamal froze. The woman standing before them could have been Tiana herself. The same warm brown eyes, the same gentle curve of her mouth, even the same slight tilt of her head. Selena Parker's eyes widened in shock as she took in the unexpected visitors, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. Can I help you?" she managed to say, her voice trembling slightly. "Hi." Jamal stepped forward, his small voice steady despite his nervousness. "I'm Jamal. I think you're my aunt." He carefully pulled out the diary from his backpack. This was my mom's, Tiana's. At the mention of her sister's name, Selena's guarded expression cracked. Her eyes filled with tears as she stared at the familiar diary. Tiana, she whispered, reaching out with shaking hands to touch the worn cover. Please, would you like to come in? She asked, stepping back to welcome them into her home. Inside, they settled in a cozy living room filled with plants and family photos. Selena sat across from them, still holding the diary as if it might disappear. We were separated when we were 13, she explained, her voice soft with old pain. Our parents divorced and the court split us up. I went with Dad to California. She stayed with Mom. Her fingers traced the diary's spine. We wrote letters at first, but then life got complicated. Addresses changed. Jamal leaned forward eagerly. Mom wrote about you all the time in her diary. She never forgot you. Selena wiped tears from her cheeks as Jamal began sharing stories about Tiana, how she would sing while cooking, her favorite books to read at bedtime, the way she could make anyone smile on their worst day. Daniel watched quietly as aunt and nephew connected, noting how Selena's mannerisms mirrored Tiana's, the same gentle laugh, the same way of tucking hair behind her ear when listening intently. He felt an unexpected warmth in his chest as he observed her kindness with Jamal. After a particularly touching story about Tiana, Selena opened her arms, and Jamal moved into them without hesitation. She held him close, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Welcome home." Daniel, too, thought it would be good for the kid if they stayed with Selena for a few days. The days at Selena's house flowed with a gentle rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Each morning brought fresh discoveries as she shared pieces of her life with Daniel and Jamal. Her home became a treasure trove of memories, with every corner holding something meaningful to explore. In the cozy living room one afternoon, Selena pulled out old photo albums bound in faded leather. Jamal sat cross-legged on the floor beside her, his eyes wide with wonder as she turned each page. "This was your mom at your age," she said, pointing to a photograph of two identical girls in matching sundresses. "She always insisted on wearing the blue dress, while I got the pink one." Daniel watched from the armchair as Selena's stories brought Tiana's childhood to life. She told them about summer days spent climbing trees, secret codes they'd invented, and the time they'd tried to teach their cat to swim. Jamal absorbed every detail, occasionally touching the photos gently, as if he could reach through time and touch his mother. "Mom never told me she could climb trees," Jamal said, amazed. "Oh, she was the brave one," Selena laughed, her eyes twinkling. "She'd go up higher than anyone else dared." As the days passed, they fell into an easy routine. During the day, Jamal explored the backyard garden, helping Selena tend to her flowers while Daniel watched from the porch. The boys' laughter echoed across the yard, reminding them both of Tiana's joy. In the evenings, after Jamal went to bed, Daniel and Selena would sit on the porch swing, sharing stories about Tiana over cups of tea. Their conversations flowed naturally, moving from memories of loss to moments of unexpected laughter. "She used to make these terrible pancakes," Daniel remembered one night, chuckling. "They were always burnt on one side and raw in the middle." Selena burst out laughing. "That doesn't surprise me at all. When we were kids, she once tried to make breakfast in bed for our mom, nearly burned down the kitchen." Their shared grief became a bridge between them, but it wasn't just sorrow that connected them. There was something comforting in the way Selena listened, in how she understood without needing explanations. Daniel found himself looking forward to these evening talks, appreciating the quiet strength that was uniquely Selena's. During quiet moments, watching her teach Jamal how to plant sunflower seeds or hearing her hum Tiana's favorite songs, Daniel realized something had shifted. The peace he felt wasn't just about finding a connection to Tiana's past. It was about discovering something new and unexpected in the present. Selena was more than just Tiana's mirror image. She had her own way of seeing the world, her own gentle wisdom that both honored her sister's memory and stood distinctly apart. Daniel found himself noticing the differences now, the way her laugh was deeper than Tiana's had been, how she gestured more when she spoke, the quiet confidence in her movements that was entirely her own. One day, Daniel sat across from her at the breakfast table, watching Jamal chase butterflies in the backyard through the window. "You know," Selena began softly, "I've been thinking, maybe you both could stay a while longer." Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee mug. Jamal deserves to know his family, to have more people who love him in his life. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The past few days had felt right in a way he hadn't expected. He watched Jamal's carefree movements outside, noting how the boy seemed more alive here, more connected to his mother's memory through Selena's presence. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice careful. "We wouldn't want to impose." Selena's eyes met his, warm and sincere. "You could never impose. This house has been too quiet for too long." They settled into a natural rhythm over the next few days. Daniel found himself fixing the loose boards on the back porch, something he'd noticed needed attention. The familiar work of hammering and measuring gave him time to think, to process the changes happening in their lives. Selena moved through the house with purpose, filling it with the smells of home-cooked meals and the sounds of gentle humming. She taught Jamal how to make his mother's favorite cookies, sharing stories of how Tiana would always sneak extra chocolate chips into the batter when they were young. "Mom really liked chocolate that much?" Jamal asked, flour dusting his cheeks. "Oh, she loved it," Selena laughed, wiping a smudge from his nose. "Once she traded her entire lunch for a chocolate bar. Drove our mother crazy." One afternoon, Mrs. Thompson from next door stopped by with a welcome basket. The elderly woman beamed at Jamal, then turned to Daniel. "You know, Selena's been such a blessing to this neighborhood," she confided. "When my Harold was sick last winter, she brought soup every day for 2 weeks. Never met anyone with a bigger heart." Daniel watched Selena blush at the praise, noticing how she deflected attention by offering Mrs. Thompson fresh cookies. It was exactly the kind of thing Tiana would have done, yet somehow uniquely Selena. The days took on a comfortable pattern. Mornings started with breakfast together, Jamal telling elaborate dreams while Selena packed his lunch for the day. Daniel would work on his police job during the day, secretly pleased when Selena stood in front of him when he came back home. Evenings found them in the living room, sharing stories and creating new memories. One morning after Jamal had gone out to play, Daniel and Selena sat on the back porch swing. The night air was cool, filled with the gentle chirping of crickets. Daniel's hand rested on the swing between them, and he found himself thinking about how natural it felt to be here. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," Selena said softly, her eyes reflecting the porch light. Daniel was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "When I first took Jamal in, I was terrified," he admitted. "Not just of being a father, but of failing Tiana, of not being enough." Selena turned to face him, her expression gentle. "And now?" "Now." He smiled, thinking of Jamal's laughter earlier that day. "Now I can't imagine any other life. He's my son in every way that matters." The swing creaked softly as they rocked. Selena shared her own confession. "I searched for Tiana for years," she said, her voice catching. "Every time I thought I was close, the trail went cold. I kept thinking if I'd just tried harder, maybe." "You can't blame yourself," Daniel said softly. "Tiana never stopped loving you. She wrote about you in her diary all the time." Their hands brushed as Selena shifted on the swing, sending a warm current through them both. Neither pulled away. The touch felt right, like a quiet acknowledgement of something growing between them. "You know what I remember most about Tiana?" Daniel asked, his voice tender. "Her capacity for joy, even in hard times. She could find light in the darkest moments." Selena's fingers intertwined with his, a gesture so natural it felt like they'd been doing it for years. "She was always like that, even when we were kids," she said. "Once, during a thunderstorm that knocked out all the power, she turned it into an adventure. We built a blanket fort and told stories until morning." Daniel felt the warmth of her hand in his, thinking how different this was from his past relationships. This wasn't just attraction or convenience. It was deeper, built on shared love for Jamal and memories of Tiana. "Sometimes," Selena continued. I see her in Jamal's smile, the way his whole face lights up just like hers did. I see her in you too, Daniel said softly. Not just in how you look, but in your heart, the way you love so completely. Their eyes met in the dim light and something shifted between them. Years of loneliness and unspoken hopes seemed to dissolve in that moment. Selena looked at Daniel, a soft smile playing on her lips. Tiana would be happy to see us like this, she whispered. They spent hours playing games, feeding ducks at the pond, and sharing stories on a checkered blanket Daniel had brought along. He watched as Selena helped Jamal make a crown of leaves, her gentle patience and loving touches reminding him of Tiana, yet unique in her own special way. Their promises were simple but heartfelt. Daniel spoke of second chances and the miracle of finding love again. Selena's voice wavered as she promised to honor both their past and their future, to love both Daniel and Jamal with all her heart. As evening settled in, Jamal came back home. The three of them found themselves on the porch, away from the celebration for a moment of quiet. Jamal sat between them, his head resting against Selena's shoulder as they gazed up at the emerging stars. The sounds of music and laughter drifted from the yard, a perfect backdrop to their peaceful moment together. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.